sharing those questions with you as we go through this. But certainly, if you are joining us, let us know where you're coming from in the chat. Always nice to see people. Mason, hello. Other people that join us quite often on these webinars. So super excited to have you all here. John, I'm here in central Pennsylvania. Where's home for you?
I'm in Maine, just looking out across the river at New Hampshire from my house.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I used to work for a company in New Hampshire. I love that area. It's stunningly beautiful. And you're still working, right? You work for a museum, is that right?
So I have worked at several museums. I am now the founding director of a garden that's evolving to be a new public garden for New Hampshire, that's
Oh,
in Lee, called Bedrock Gardens, a really magical place. So,
oh, that's fantastic. Well, I am thrilled to have people here. We've got Pat from Colorado, and Mason lives in the Philadelphia suburbs, Hamilton, Ontario. John's new book is open in front of me. That's awesome, Suzanne. I will say that I'm a reader and a gardener, so I have absolutely loved having an opportunity to read his book, and I have really enjoyed the artwork. It is just stunning, John.
thank you. I can't tell you how lucky I feel to have had Mary Azarian do the artwork. And then the publishing house did a wonderful thing colorizing prints so that they would just thread together with this beautiful colorization, because her work is largely in black and white. But it gives opportunity for really magnificent things like this. This is folks haying a field, which I see this scene around me. I did just yesterday on my way to work. Somebody doing the same thing still in the town where Bedrock Gardens is. So it's a pleasure to see traditional handcrafted work go into a book about craft. And I've always admired her work. So thank you.
That is so stunning. I also love that, I would say, pastoral 1800s looking scene, being just an hour away from the beautiful area that is Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which is Amish country. If you ever get an opportunity, for anybody that's listening here backstage, to go to Amish country and participate in seeing the harvest, which usually happens in the September-October timeframe, it is literally like watching a painting from 200 years ago. It is stunning. So I absolutely love to be able to see that. And it's so exciting to see a painting that looks like that. It literally looks just like what you shared there, which is really exciting.
And what I love and think is also really exciting is that this is part of a new movement. So it's not even just something antiquated, but we are reviving agriculture all around the country. And so this is old, and it's also the new face for a lot of our landscapes, because it had been a long time since we engaged well with our local farms. So
absolutely, 100%. So we are just getting ready to go here backstage, and we're recording here locally as well. So I'm having a little trouble to post to Facebook today, so I will post that afterwards. I'm going to let those folks know that. But I am super excited to be able to host the Heirloom Gardener, John Forti. He was kind enough to send me a copy of the book in advance of this webinar. And I can tell you, John, it has just really been a warm cup of coffee to my soul, or tea in your case. It's just
I drink
really...
both.
Me too. But I have absolutely loved reading this prose, and I want to thank you for your inspirational messaging, because I think right now we need a book about how we can come together as a community. And I love how you have really embraced things from your childhood that inspired you. And I love stories. So I was hoping you would be willing to maybe share the story about your childhood experience with yarrow. I think the audience will love that.
All right. Well, it's a all of the essays that I wrote for this book run, some of them long, some of them short. This one is a middle length, so I'll, lend ear, but I'll try to read from it quickly. So again, about yarrow as a plant. So it says, plants are storytellers that draw us into the natural world, and some of these botanical revelations can be formative. Once, when I was little, I cut my leg chasing a dragonfly through a nearby field, and in response, some old Yankee neighbors introduced me to yarrow. They matter-of-factly plucked some yarrow leaves and handed them to me to crush in my fingers and hold against the cut. I was amazed. The bleeding stopped immediately. I'd witnessed magic from the natural world, and a veil lifted. I saw plants had properties that ran far deeper than fragrance, taste, and beauty. They had deeper scientific roots, and like people, they had homelands, personalities, names, and ways of expressing themselves. More importantly, I learned that plants could be my allies. The generic name Achillea millefolium honors Achilles, of Greek mythology, who used it in battle against arrow or yarrow wounds during the Battle of Troy. The specific epithets translates to thousand leaves because each feathery leaf seems to be made up of 1,000 smaller fronds. The common name of yarrow in years past was nosebleed, a reference to the plant's styptic benefit. And then I list a few other names that it went by, and go on to say that besides the doctrine of signatures, Europeans ascribed to one another a way of understanding medicine, one that was akin to traditional Chinese medicine. The doctrine of humors, from the Latin for liquid, was based on an ancient Greek theory concerning bodily fluids that were to determine health and temperament. I go on to explain that theory more, but then come back to saying that yarrow, being cool and dry, would stop the flow of warm, moist blood in a young kid's leg hundreds of years from those ancient roots and tomes. It's also why yarrow tea was sipped for internal bleeding and to strengthen intestines, liver, and kidneys. Cool and dry herbs, like yarrow, carry a bitter, tart flavor profile. No surprise, then, that the flowers, leaves, and intensely bitter roots of yarrow have been long used in making liqueurs, tinctures, and digestive bitters that help to process fatty, mostly warm and moist foods. Historical culinary descriptors often sound unpleasant, especially when marketing has caused us to equate bitter with bad. But remember, as you noted when we first spoke, many of us begin our days with a bitter brew known as coffee, or sip a tart lemonade with lunch, or finish out the day with a hoppy beer. Like in the Middle Ages, yarrow was commonly part of a botanical blend, lending a bitter agent to gruit or beer made before hops, the same principle that applied centuries later when we took it to mixing bitters and tonics into cocktails for added depth of flavor and to assist the kidneys even as we tax them by drinking booze. And now that we can determine the chemical constituents present in plants, we can understand why, in this instance, yarrow works as a styptic, astringent, diaphoretic, and tonic. Chemical analysis today shows that yarrow contains salicylic acid and flavonoids, and knowing this helps explain many and support many of yarrow's earlier uses in traditional folk medicine and other ethnobotanical purposes. For example, yarrow's dark blue essential oil made by steam distillation of the flowers kills the larva of a mosquito. And then a common branch of science also shows how several cavity nesting birds, like the common starling, use yarrow to line their nests, suggesting that adding yarrow to nests inhibits the growth of parasites. Once again, we were reminded that we live in an interconnected web and that there is benefit to looking for the commonalities we share when living in habitat together. I go on to explain a little about how yarrow can be used in the home and garden and the landscape, how it's a great thing to diversify lawns, and then I just conclude by saying any good gardener knows that our gardens encourage us to keep our hands in the earth and grow alongside of them. Planting our allies like yarrow can help even feather your own nest. And certainly one of the longest standing craft traditions in my life is with this old ally. Each spring, I gather the lush emerging leaves and flowers and craft them into an oil that will be blended into my annual batch of herbal healing salve. I think I have one here. Each
Oh,
batch
it's beautiful.
carries, thank you. Each batch carries lessons and reminders from me. One lesson from the field where we first met, one from my neighbors, one from the old herbals, and one from yarrow itself. I can almost hear its cool, dry, raspy voice reminding me to harvest the healthiest leaves when they are at their peak. Later in the season, yarrow and some bees conspire to remind me that it's time to harvest the nectar-laden flowers. The result is a melding of the natural world and a legacy of understanding from the ancients through scientific monographs, blended together in a tiny little apothecary jar.
Ah,
So that's a reading from Yarrow.
so thank you so much for sharing that. I absolutely loved that story because it just shows how, you can pique the interest of a child by, exposing them early on. In your case, from an accident, you got exposed to plants and it piqued your interest. But the way you write that story and the way that you talk about yarrow makes me want to go out and collect blooms now that I see the bees visiting, and makes me really want to understand tinctures. So I was curious that, you're seeing a lot of people return to sort of the crafting with wildflowers and with plants. Why do you think that, did pandemic inspire people perhaps to that return to the ancient traditions, similar to, the gardens of our grandparents, the victory gardens, and war inspired them to come and as the common good to come together and learn something and maybe do something that their grandparents did that they didn't know.
Yeah, I think you pull up a great example, and I do get into victory gardens in the book as a method where that happened. And I think that the pandemic caused a lot of us to step back from the grind, really. I think the pace of life has become ridiculous. It's why I work with an organization called Slow Food. And I think when we paused and realized just how much of a rat race we were participating. I have friends that would drive 2 and 3 hours a day just for a commute and then work extended hours long beyond what a work week was ever designed to be. And when we got back to our homes and our gardens, I think a lot of us rediscovered the joy of getting your hands in the dirt, planting seeds and taking that process from seed to table, and really maybe for many eating the fruits of their own labors for the first time, and getting their kids involved and finding genuine ways to enrich their lives. And what we've seen in the last couple of years is the rise of gardening as a, I'm not even going to use the word pastime because I think that degrades it, as a lifestyle that we have as many people gardening now as we did during the highest, at the peak of victory gardens during World War II. And at that time, the whole nation turned on a dime. They went from a nation that was starting to abandon gardening because agriculture had largely moved to the Midwest, to almost half of the nation's produce being grown in backyard victory gardens.
Right.
People were learning canning and putting things up. And I feel like those are genuine experiences that really have reconnected us, because once you taste a sun-ripened tomato, there's no going back to those sun-ripened tomatoes or those bloated strawberries in a supermarket when you've had the real thing. And so I do think it's been a major reconnection, but also a lesson in slowing down. I think sometimes we've come to be in such a soundbite culture that we have a lot of folks raised up with the attention span of a flea. And when you get to gardening, you slow down to a different pace of life. It nurtures something deep in us that I think also reminds us that it's the slow and steady that really builds meaningful things. And and then the science backs it up too. When you have food that's sun ripened in place instead of harvested unripe and shipped thousands of miles, it can have as much as 70% greater nutritional value. So it's also that investment that comes back around to our families and our overall well-being.
Absolutely. And we certainly saw that during pandemic. Gardening became one of the number one hobbies in the United States. And Burpee and other seed catalogs were having the best year of their absolute history. If you look at some of them that have been in business since the late 1700s, this year, 2021, is their best fiscal year ever. And I know a lot of the companies that I buy from were selling out, and this year had the same issues in terms of shipping. They literally had run out of product. But you bring up a great point, which is there's this generational knowledge that gets passed down, but if it doesn't get passed down, it becomes lost. And I really love that. If pandemic did anything, it sort of reset us and made us realize the value of, first of all, being connected in the moment. Gardening for me doesn't allow you to time travel. You have to like focus right where you are. But in addition, it also gives you an opportunity to teach. And I know for myself and for the Thoughtful Gardening channel, I wanted to create almost like a teaching video every day, because I was seeing the supply chain breakdown. I'm very fortunate to live within driving distance of about 15 minutes of farms. And, but a lot of the country isn't. And so I wanted people to be inspired, but also be courageous and have the courage to plant those seeds and nurture them and try to get gardens to grow. And it seems to me that that passion is continuing, and there is a resurgence and interest in being able to provide for your family, especially with the increasing food cost of 12 to 20%, depending on who you're reading right now. But there is that kind of, as Suzanne is saying, much is to be said in the moment of Zen, when gardening, great natural medicine to bring calm and curing for the craziness of this world. And I wanted to say, John, I want to thank you for such an inspirational message. It's encouraging you. I felt like you were cheering me on in my own garden as I read your book, but it's not preachy. And there are people who get very preachy in this space to say, you got to rip out your lawn. It's not natural. And I didn't hear you saying that. I felt like instead you were very encouraging and celebrating that people were embracing this, what I like to say, garden craft.
Well, I think we're all learning over time about the environmental impacts that exist and how we can play into creating little green bridges, green corridors, and then whole swaths of the country that improve habitat, preserve biodiversity. And so maybe in some ways you can actually time travel when you garden, because when you're planting heirloom seeds, you are going back into a piece of the past, but bringing it into the future so that we have a sustainable future. And I've always preferred as an educator to show people proven and effective ways to do things instead of tell them why they should do it my way. And I've been a lifelong organic gardener, but I can lecture anywhere in the world, but I can be in Arkansas or California, Brooklyn or Philly, and people hear a message the same way, because nobody wants to poison their groundwater or their grandkids with lawn chemicals. We need to know alternatives. And
Absolutely.
we came through a generation that said better living through science, but we also realized with Rachel Carson and others that 70% of those old agricultural chemicals were quietly disappeared because of toxicity issues. So what I like to do is teach methods that are easy to embrace, and you do what you do. Maybe you just let part of your lawn go to meadow, or maybe you increase some garden space in your gardens. But that doesn't mean lawns are evil and you need to get rid of it. Maybe you need to keep a swath clear because you've got dogs, or there's a bad tick year, or we all have variations in our landscape. So this book is more about inspiring change instead of preaching. And I'm glad you can see the difference, because I work really hard to look at this book as a way to find common ground, because honestly, I think a lot of us have been looking at a deeply fractured nation. And when you are able to reach across a garden gate and talk to your neighbors, or when you all get together for dinner with stuff you ate from a garden, you have conversation that reminds you we're not opposites, we're just people, and we don't have to agree on everything, but we can find common grounds, and that these heirloom seeds are really our common cultural inheritance. They have been handed down to us. So that act of preservation is also an important part of, for me at least, what I take away is the pleasure in gardening, because I know that I'm accomplishing things for the health of my environment, the pollinators around me, but also I'm eating pretty damn well from the garden.
A
And
hundred
maybe too
percent.
well. I got older and rounder during this pandemic, and I'll work on that now. But
Yeah,
I was in the house writing a lot. But
yeah.
it's time again to just enjoy those gardens this season. I feel like we've come out of um, Kansas black and white into color Technicolor Oz this spring, like seeing your smile, but seeing them in person from people and hugging people and getting
Yeah.
together over meals. That's a real pleasure. And I feel like this book is emerging at the same time with a similar message.
I agree. And you said a lot of really important things there. I think first and foremost, it's the little things, right? I think pandemic made us appreciate what was really important. And you are right. There is such joy in being able to walk out in my garden and pop a sun gold tomato, in my mouth, and it's just tastes like sunshine. And and then also too, there's power in that, right? Like I don't have to depend on anybody to eat today. I can walk out in my backyard and I can have lunch. Salad is out there and peas are out there, and the new things are coming in. It's just stunning to me. We've had a lot of rain here in central Pennsylvania the last few weeks, and the plants are doubling in size. And you get so excited. It's like every day there's something new to explore in the garden. And
And try to get a kid to eat a pea that they didn't grow. But when you engage kids in that kind of thing, that sense of wonder carries over to them too and
uh,
builds lifelong gardeners.
completely agree. And I think, this is a beautiful thing that I see with my nieces and nephews. They love to come out and play in the garden, but my niece has celiac disease, a true celiac, not just we think she does. It's been diagnosed. And so she's very careful, we have to be super careful about what she eats. And she loves pickles, and pickles are on the list. So she'll have pickles breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but she grows a lot of cucumbers in her own garden. And just to see this awareness in her and excitement in her, and getting her to embrace pollinators. I love when you talk about green corridors. This is something I talk about, is that look, everybody can help support pollinators in their own backyard. Even if you just have a pot on your front porch by growing natives, you too can make a difference. But we as homeowners, and here in Pennsylvania, we have 2 million acres of grass. And so I encourage people to think about that differently. 80% of our land here is privately owned. And so everybody can, start to, create little pollinator islands, and all of a sudden those become corridors. And now we've got huge green spaces. And I was in my garden this morning talking to my mom, who's a gardener in North Carolina, and she's like, "Are you out in the yard? I can barely hear you for the birds."
Same here.
I can hear your birds in the background. But you demonstrate that kind of interconnectedness and web of life, and how it is important that what we do in our own backyards has significant impact on the earth and all of its inhabitants. So, how do we encourage those who are maybe part of this movement to get others on board?
Well, for me, even if you don't consider yourself part of a movement, or if you're a gardener, you know the pleasure in sharing a plant from your garden, dividing a perennial, maybe sharing old seeds. And, when you spoke about the seed houses having a hard time keeping up with production and shipping last year, well, what's an old skill we can share that's helpful? Seed saving. And to take a plant from a plant you grew the previous year to seed that you're planting again the next year, you're keeping an age-old art alive, really, that was about improving our food quality with every generation's harvest of seed. I mean, if my grandfather ate a tomato, he'd smear the seeds across a brown paper shopping bag and he'd write plum tomato on it, or I'll write Matt's wild cherry tomato on it, or whatever it might be. And you put it aside because it was the first tomato to come in, the one that didn't split or get a disease. And you adapt them to your space in particular when you're saving heirloom seeds that are open pollinated. So for me, it's sharing those sorts of gifts, sharing skills, composting, just your own best practices with your neighbors, whether it's in a garden club or across a fence or at a farmer's market, because it's places like that when we take others to these markets, we're helping them see another way of keeping land available for farming around us, helping kids understand where their food comes from. And those farmers are also great at sharing some best practices. And maybe you end up wanting to keep chickens at home. Not me so much, but maybe it's bees. Maybe it's, and finding the things that really work for you. And while the world has seemed pretty overwhelming in recent years, I think we also can share the excitement about what's been building, because as much as there's been a lot of scary stuff happening, I think that we've been in the past 20 years, think back to Farm Aid and then the slow food coming to the country and all these different movements that help people think about local agriculture. In the last 15 years, since I started a slow food chapter and became a governor for the region, we've gone from fewer than 2,000 farmers markets in the country to over 20,000 farmers markets
Wow, amazing.
year round where I am, which is in Maine. So
Right,
if you can do it in Maine, you can do it anywhere.
true.
But to share those sorts of experiences with people, Michael Pollan says that farmers markets are the new community gathering spaces in America. And I really love that idea that these are things about building community and, again, finding common ground. So bringing others in that way instead of saying you should garden organically, you shouldn't kill pollinators. What does that mean to somebody?
Right.
But tools, that's what this book is all about, is sharing tools and joys. And gardeners have always been good at that. We see every spring as a chance for a fresh start.
Absolutely. And certainly during pandemic, that was something that was important to me, as people were saying, I can't get seeds either because their governors were restricting access to seeds or they just weren't available. I started saying, what is it that people need? And so I put 30 packages of seeds to gardeners all over the country. That was my little COVID, protest, for people that were having trouble. I could share seeds from my own garden as well as some of the heirloom seeds that I buy from Baker's Creek and other suppliers. That I think you're 100% right. Your story of your grandpa saving tomato seeds on paper bags. I do that. My husband thinks I'm crazy because I'm constantly harvesting seeds, but it's truly a joy to be able to, dig up those perennials and share them. And I did that earlier this year with a group of girlfriends. I'm like, please come for lunch. And also, I'm going to just share whatever you like in my garden. I need to divide these. And a friend sent a picture and said, is this a weed or is this something you gave me?
So which was it, or was it
It,
both? No.
it was a cut leaf coneflower that's got about 5 feet tall. I said, you're going to need to cut that back, because it's going to be about 9 feet tall if you don't. At least in my garden, they get that tall. So, but I love that you encourage people to experiment. Will say that I have a perfectionist tendency sometimes, that if I can't get it right, I don't want to do it. And I feel like you are saying, forget it. If it's not perfect, don't worry about it. Just go for it. Give it a shot. But you do a lot of experimentation with herbs and flowers, whether it's food or tinctures, cordials, elixirs, and salve. If someone wants to wildcraft, what are some resources that you recommend if someone like me wants to try to start to save some of these flowers and do something different with them?
Mhm. Well, one of the ways that I write about in my book that I think can be a great lesson shared is as a tool for learning the plants in your own backyard is making an herbarium. Um, I wish I had an herbarium here to show you. I can probably find you a picture in a book, but throughout the centuries, families went out botanizing and they pressed botanical specimens in books. I have a copy of Emily Dickinson's herbarium out in my car that I'm taking to an event this weekend. Uh, and actually, I think here's a page from that in a different book. I don't know if this will show well enough, but
Yes,
you
we
can
can see
see
it.
how she's pressed botanical specimens to a page. And some of the museums that I've worked at have had herbaria collected by especially young women who weren't always afforded educations to learn about science and botany and horticulture. And there were some that would have, gathered by grandfather's grave. Grandmother says use it this way for medicine and for food. Making an herbarium can be a great way, not just for kids, but for a family to explore the plants of their backyard. Because, I mean, that was household botany. It's how you didn't poison yourself, it's how you fed yourself, and how you medicated yourself. Because
Right.
if this is all new to you, plant knowledge is key. You have to start with the plants you know best. And so I've always worked best with teaching people about the food plants they already know and their benefits for medicine when they come to the table or in a teapot. Um, or as you said, in a cordial, which I write about, or bitters or salves, that are ways that we craft from our garden. But knowing the plant first is key. Back to community, one of the best ways to do that is for somebody in your neighborhood to go out with Heather in the garden and learn what cutleaf coneflower is all about. And then you have a tried and true message from somebody that's telling you from their personal experience. Oh yeah, you can do this. The same way maybe you'll learn 15 different ways to present a cucumber to a table, or just eat it fresh from the garden, or drive along eating it as your lunch, as I sometimes do. Um, they're just nice ways to build upon knowledge. I think if you are going out foraging or wildcrafting, of course, when we look to history, we've also seen lots of horrible examples of things like people over harvesting and wiping out native populations of plants. So it's really important to practice good foraging guidelines. And I do write about those in the book as well. But typically just pass by the first plants you see until you go and find them in a place where they're in such incredible abundance that you can take a small portion. But again, just keep do, bringing them home, learning about them. But then if it's something that's more rare and unusual, I'll use ramps as an example. They're the
Right.
wild leek that grows that's been over harvested many times through history. But I've also found that they're incredibly easy to grow from seed or by just planting some of the rootlets. So
Right.
I have a whole pasture of them growing now in my
Awesome.
own backyard. I don't have to go out and forage for them. So it's things like that that help us bring it home, but also maybe get to drink a delicious cordial from, I think, yeah, this one is blackberries from last season and bee balm, because bee balm
Awesome.
is a delicious accompaniment. And we'll have to drink that real soon because there are new blackberries coming. Damn, no.
Yeah, no, I love that you encourage that sense of exploration and trying something new. But it's also important to, if you're not sure when you're doing something, ask. I mean, most gardeners are like us. We're really excited and happy to tell you what we know. And I get lots of questions on my Facebook page. I'm always happy to entertain a question. And if I don't know, I'll reach out to an expert like John and say, hey, I've got this really great question. Can you help me? And I think, most gardeners are very giving. They're happy to share their experiences and their failures. A recent story that happened to me, my husband's a cardiologist. And so they use digitalis in their practice to treat patients in a pill form. So I showed him happily that we have it growing in our garden this year. And he's like, oh, I'd like to eat that. And I'm like, please don't. I'm like, like, I don't know the dose of that. Please don't eat that. I'm not quite sure what it would do to you, but let's try not to kill the cardiologist. We might need you one day. But
Exactly. You bring up a good example. Some
yeah,
things are about very specific doses, and some plants are just very user friendly and others are not. And
Right.
that doesn't mean you shouldn't grow foxglove. I couldn't not have it in my gardens, but it's learning those details that is hugely impactful. Not to be afraid of plants, because we also came through a part of the last century where people were actively taught to fear plants and herbalism by an emerging industry. And now we're getting that rebalancing happening. And part of that's because we've been able to understand the chemistry and the science behind plants to help validate use or nix old uses that are no longer appropriate. But it's also a great exploration time again for our culture, because when you look at whole plants, I'll throw out something like St. John's wort. When we work on the chemical analysis of that plant, we know there are 106 active chemical constituents.
Wow.
But when we try to turn it into a pill form, they put hypericin in the pill, one. And we've lost all of that other complexity that has a long history of working to improve the sanguine humor or make you sanguine or well, or when we saw that kale was good for colon cancer, we tried to turn it into a pill and quickly realized pills don't do anything, because sometimes you just need to eat your damn roughage. And that's a part of that chemically complex plant that gardeners have known for centuries.
Yeah, so that's really brings up a great point, and it's interesting, like you said, like the tomato plant itself is poisonous, but tomatoes were not. But I remember the story of the gentleman who took a bite out of a tomato and didn't die from it. They were all convinced he was going to die. A long time story I remember from a long time ago. But you talk about the book, and as a celebration, sort of between the earth and its bounty. And I'm curious to know who in your life was an influence for you to learn how to do the things with the plants, who imparted all of this really interesting knowledge that you share with us here in the book.
Well, I have to say, probably like you, sharing plants from your garden, anybody that ever touched us as a gardener leaves an impact. And it's a good reason for us to think about who we're mentoring in this life too. But for me, there were great influences just in my neighborhood. I grew up along a river, and the people that lived just up the hill from us in an old arts and crafts shingle mansion were just great gardeners. They're actually the ones that I write about in the story of Yarrow. But also, I went up to them a few Christmases ago when they were still alive, and I said, I just need to thank you, because you really helped bring me to this whole lifelong career as a horticulturist. And they said, you came with an interest. We just helped nurture it. And I think that's what so many of us find in life, is that that's nurtured by those around us. And we don't even know it. My grandparents, that grandfather I told you about, and my grandmother, they sun-dried tomatoes up on their back porch on window screens. And he had a trellis with beans that would climb all 4 stories, or 3 stories, and he'd climb up and down that to get into the garden until he was 90. He had figs and pears, and these are all things that I remember. But then when I started making cordials, I brought one to a family party, and my uncle said, oh, just like your grandfather. I said, what? He made cordials? Oh, yeah. Don't you remember up on top of his icebox? And clearly I wasn't drinking enough as a child so that I remembered. And he died when I was fairly young. But he was a 19th century guy. He was born in the 1890s, and he just had all these skills that I watched many of that generation through friends in the Herb Society or garden clubs, and they kept knowledge alive through the centuries in ways they weren't even aware they were doing. Or when people had to weed in victory gardens, maybe they didn't love it as a kid, but those same kids went on to teach their kids all of these great skills and help them develop wonderful things like you're doing in this world. So
Absolutely. And that's true of my story. My grandfather, I was one of 12 grandchildren, so he always grew a huge vegetable garden for us. And I would take long walks with him in that garden. And he would talk to me about the years that his honeybees did well, his garden did well. And that inspired me moving to the Northeast, where our garden season is very condensed. of how can I get more pollinators in my garden. So I just intuitively started planting native pollinator plants and high nectar source plants in between my vegetables. And if you were to visit today, you would see that I've got flowers in between, like your nasturtiums that you talk about, and I absolutely love, and the
Mhm.
bees go crazy for. But I noticed today as I was walking, in my garden, the pollinator plants that border my vegetable garden are abuzz, literally, with
Mhm.
hundreds and hundreds of native bees. Some of them sleeping very sweetly in the flowers, and I'll post some of those
I love
pictures
that.
today. But I can hear them before I can see them. I have a flowering raspberry right now, and they buzz pollinate. So the sound of that before I can even see it. And so I'm very grateful to my grandfather, and my father forced me as a child to pull weeds as part of my chores, which I did not love. But I find that task now very like meditative almost. There's a something about it that is just super relaxing because I'm forced to stay in that moment. So Suzanne is also saying in our comments here, your book sends a message to look back through art and nature to live better in this now. My granddaughter's spirit and joy soar in nature. And at the Royal Botanical Garden in Burlington these days, they are thrilled to see they are growing tomatoes and cucumbers. So
Mhm. That's a huge cultural shift. I remember that same grandfather I told you about when he'd come to our house along the river. He'd slip tomato plants in between my mother's peonies, an eggplant between the hosta. And I thought, you crazy old man, people don't do that. And clearly, I've become one of those crazy old men, but people do that now because we've learned lessons. During the Victory Garden era, they would say plant flowers for home front morale, but they were also helping recognize in that statement that you're bringing pollinators to your garden. So if you think you're just going to grow a bunch of sweet watermelons, you're going to need more help. So, but all of those influences, I think if any of us think back to who they were or what those formative experiences were, we'd want to do more to be sharing them. So I had those in my youth, but then I've also had the good fortune to have a long series of careers that I've truly loved. When I was first out of college, I was the horticulturist for a museum called Plymouth Plantation on Cape Cod that worked with the Wampanoag community, one of the First Nations, and the Pilgrim story. I went from there to another very old town, Portsmouth, New Hampshire, to be the curator of historic landscapes at Strawberry Bank Museum that had 4 centuries of original gardens in that neighborhood. Then to the Massachusetts Horticultural Society that started a school gardens movement, and really just layers and layers now at Bedrock Gardens that have helped me really explore what people have done in the past and borrow from those things, help meld them into stories that we can hear a little bit easier than saying do it sustainably. These were just people that knew that if you didn't live in consort with your environment or in a reciprocal relationship, that you'd only got back what you put into it. If you didn't build soil, you didn't get fertility, and crops didn't succeed. They got things at a very basic level, the same way we always say don't pee in the well where you live. You need to keep a good, clean, healthy environment
right.
for the food you grow. It's part of what I like about the local foods movement and gardening. You think about that more, but also you just care more deeply about engaging all of the senses and your own backyard to make something to improve a space.
Absolutely. And you bring up a great, some great points there. Certainly, we are seeing more interest and as well as education coming out about, how important soil is and how we treat the soil and why we want to build the soil up. And so I do a lot of cover crops I have a fruit wall, I call it,
Mm.
that turns into my insectary. So it's transitioning right now from the beautiful crimson clover now to all the wildflowers that I grow for the pollinators. But what I can tell you about that soil is it was terrible, compact, disgusting. at the bottom of a stone wall, and it was horrific to dig in. We have a very shallow limestone, so if you put a shovel in the soil, it would literally jolt you with electricity. But now that I've planted carrots and radishes and things in that area to break up and feed the soil is becoming this rich, loamy, beautiful, that I have put no chemicals on whatsoever. So your point, and we don't have to grow things in straight rows, that there are companion plants that not only attract pollinators, but are your army for keeping out the bad guys. So your nasturtiums, for example, great thing to have in the garden, not only to eat, and not only are they beautiful, but you bring up a lot of new uses of that I'm super excited about this season to try. So can you talk a little bit about maybe nasturtiums and some of the things that you like to do with them?
Sure. Well, one of the things that I think is great about nasturtiums, first of all, is kid engagement. And I've designed a lot of children's gardens. I don't have or want kids, but I love having that little dose with kids where you can make an impact and leave. But I find it's really wonderful to take those little seeds like brains and help a kid understand, all right, this is the size of a seed. You only push a seed as far under the ground as the seed is big around. They come up quickly, but then they've got these great Monet-like lily pad type leaves that are just beautiful, and they taste like garden cress. So early on, they don't have to have all the patience in the world yet. They can start eating a few leaves here and there. But then when the flowers come out, that nectar is so sweet in them. For a spicy plant, you get sweet and spicy, which is an unusual flavor profile. So I like to do things like put Boursin cheese inside, or some people use goat cheese or cream cheese, or put some mild cheese inside, or a spread of some sort. And you just fold the flour up around it. I put them on salads, just whole flowers. I make herbal vinegar with them. But I also just put them in almost every hanging basket and big planter I have, because what do they attract? They bring around things like bumblebees. And one of my greatest joys is sitting looking out my window towards the river past a bird bath that's hanging next to a fuchsia, and I get so many hummingbirds. And between the fuchsia and the nasturtiums in my yard, I think both are pretty much responsible for all the hummingbirds that take up residence here. So those are some of the key uses, but I've also planted them really early because I always took inspiration from a place called the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum near me. And since for over 100 years now, they've been planting them up on the third floor in a courtyard, and they just cascade down the 3 floors. And it's a pretty amazing spectacle when you see it.
And I noticed you had a picture of Monet's garden as well on your page. And I have traveled to Gavarni, and I can remember seeing them ambling out into he's got lots of alleys between his garden. And they just sort of ramble. And that's what's happening in my vegetable garden. They cascade and ramble. And my favorite thing to do is I take one of those and grab my cherry tomato and I just pop it straight in my mouth, because you get the sweet tomato and the peppery. Some of them are really spicy, by the way. So that's a warning there.
But what a nice combination. And again, fresh instead of gooping things up. I think we're all learning how to eat more lightly as well. And, it's interesting too, because a lot of the peasant diets that we kind of scorned for centuries are just the thing we're all saying people should be eating now. And instead of adding goopy salad dressings or that cheese that I told you about, you've got the perfect combination right there. Get a tomato or a ground cherry and just pop them in your mouth for that interesting flavor combination.
Absolutely.
So again, sharing with other gardeners, that's part of the pleasure of it.
100%. And I have a friend called Miss Know-It-All, and she's wrote a book called Eat Your Flowers, and she's got some really great rice paper wrap with the nasturtiums for like a vegetable wrap. So I'm looking forward to giving that a try this year. If you're looking for inspiration, that's a great book for how to eat the flowers that are growing in your garden. Obviously, chemical free. I would not recommend you eat violets on a on a lawn that's been treated for sure. But
Yeah.
you also give lots of great things to do with lavender, and my lavender is in full bloom right now, and no one's more excited than me and the bees. That's one of my favorite things to do, is just to sit down there and watch them get drunk on lavender flowers. So I'm
Mhm.
curious what your favorite things are to do with lavender, and maybe I'll be inspired to go try something new.
Huh. Well, I don't have a still right by me that I can pop open and show you, but um, I do distill lavender a lot to make lavender water, to make an essential oil of lavender. And when you put them up, I mean, lavender water has been used a lot for laundry, for things that you want to keep moths out of, because it's also a great moth repellent. But the fragrance of it is just an amazing thing. It's for people certainly to, when you have, and I've just been doing some of the same, harvesting lavender because it's the season. But what does lavender do for your senses? It calms you. It's like a balm, but it also wakes up your senses. And so for a lot of generations, it was put into posies or nosegays, they'd call them, because it makes your nose happy. Um, People would also just hang bundles in their closets with their woolens. But another thing that I've always had fun doing is taking that fresh lavender, and when it's fresh, you can turn it into lavender wands or lavender bottles.
Cool.
So you take the flowers just behind the flower head. See if I can do this. It's like tying your tie backwards. You bend the flower head in, and you do that with, I typically use 13, but you bend the heads backwards. You can see the likeness of this to that, so that all the flowers are inside the bottle.
Right?
And then you fold the stems back around. So the stems make up and obscure all the flowers, but then you weave ribbon in and out, just like you might make a basket, over and under, or a lattice top to a pie, so that it makes a little cage around them. And that smell never goes away. You just roll it around in your fingers if you need to revive it. But a lot of our grandmothers would have put these in their drawers so they'd keep out moths, but also bed bugs and things like that. In other times when you walked around streets where the scents weren't so great, you walked around with things like this.
It
People
was the
put
modern
lavender.
day perfume instead of
Yep,
the
you know
shower.
it. Yeah. And also people, as you mentioned, perfume, would put the perfumes on their pulse points, because just the very beating of your heart and the pulse heats those points where your veins are closest to the surface, and that's why we perfume there. And if you use something like lavender, today we call it aromatherapy, but throughout history, they understood that concept. They didn't use that word, but they also used the pulse point because it kept refreshing and putting the medicinal qualities of an herb back out into the air, so that in the instance of lavender, it's calming you and calming your spirits every time your heart beats, really.
Oh, it's so beautiful. And I'm so excited about that lavender wand. I'll have to do that with my niece. She will absolutely love that. And I think my clothes would love that too, because that sounds like a really fun activity to do in the garden. So, John, I am so inspired by your book, and there's so many wonderful comments back here. That lots of people saying they're inspired, and thank you so much for being with us. I'm curious if people are interested in your book, which is available now. What's the recommendation for finding you and for finding the book?
Well, a big part of the work I do is trying to help rebuild local economies and local jobs through farming and agriculture, but in every way. So I always recommend go to your local bookstore, buy it in person from somebody who's trying to keep a local business alive, because when you spend money locally, 70 cents on every dollar staying in your community instead of 10 cents. So I love keeping those bookshops alive. If you don't have one in your community, well, you've got a good opportunity to open one, but you can also just go online and order. I'm kind of gobsmacked because the first printing sold out before the book came out, as apparently
Wow.
did the second. So it's coming out in its third printing. So you're going to have better luck buying it in bookstores until the second printing comes out. But you can also keep trying online too. But
Fantastic.
yeah, it's just was released this week, and it's been a really wonderful thing to watch it coming out in the world. I think there's an old expression that I don't know if it's an expression, but it's something I've been saying to myself for years. The bigger the mainstream gets, the more room there is for an undercurrent. And I think with gardening, there's been an undercurrent afoot for a while that's helping create some really positive change.
Great.
And so I hope everybody finds this book as a great way to take part in some solutions and not feel like the world is spinning out of their control, because in your garden, maybe you don't have full control over anything, but you can influence an awful lot and eat some pretty delicious things along the way in the evolution. So I hope you get it and enjoy it.
Absolutely. No, it is definitely a great buy for gardeners and for those who are interested in crafting from the garden. I highly recommend it. It's also just a beautiful piece of prose. It warms your heart. So it's been one of my favorite reads so far this year. So I'm really excited that you were able to join us. And if people want to find you online, John, can you let them know where's the best place to follow you?
Sure, and thank you. My website is where you can find different lecture offerings that I have, and more information, bio information and things like that. That is jforti.com. But also, I think most of the folks that have come to know me that have helped make this book fly off shelves are the amazing folks on my Heirloom Gardener page. So on Facebook, I have a page called the Heirloom Gardener John Forti. And I've been posting there for several years. But also I'm amazed to watch some posts go out to millions, and people, like 300,000 people sharing this book out there into the world in ways that have clearly helped move it off of shelves. So thank you, everybody. And but those are the two primary ways: through my Heirloom Gardener John Forti page on Facebook, through my website, and also come visit if you're anywhere traveling to or through New England. Google Bedrock Gardens in Lee, New Hampshire, and I hope you'll come find us there, because we'll also be working towards developing a garden craft series in the future that brings a lot to life that you find here in this book about gardening as a craft, because we really are starting to see a whole new arts and crafts movement in the nation that's born out of the land and landscape. And that's what this book really tries to help carry forth. So
Absolutely. And
anyways,
Patty
thank you.
Joy said she made your solstice cookies, so I'm going to have to look for that recipe. And she said they were wonderful. So with that, John, I am very grateful to have you here with me today. If you're interested in learning more about pollinators and how to garden, certainly please follow me on my new YouTube channel, Garden Thoughtfully. And John, I really am so excited about your book. Congratulations on selling out the first 3 printings. Not surprised here. People are saying thank you so much. We enjoyed this discussion very much. So with that, thank you all for being here backstage with us, and we will post this to Facebook. Apologies since I am a little backstage limited right now, but appreciate Facebook people's patience on that, and we'll get that up later today. So John, thank you so much. It's just a wonderful discussion, and I have put Bedrock Gardens in my notes and coming up to do some fall foliage and October timeframe, so hope to be able to meet you in person.
Likewise, and thank you for gardening thoughtfully.
Oh,
Bye-bye, everybody, and thanks so
bye. Have a
much.
great afternoon.
Take care,
Take
Heather. You
care.
too.
Bye now.